June 22nd, 1941, Engels Air Force Training Base, Soviet Union. Major Yevgeny Prokofiev stood on the airfield watching new pilot trainees climb into their training aircraft, his expression reflecting the contempt he made no effort to hide. The trainees were women, over 400 of them, recruited as part of a desperate expansion of Soviet military aviation following the German invasion that had begun just hours earlier. "This is madness," Prokofiev muttered to his fellow instructor, Captain Dmitry Volkov. "Women flying combat aircraft? They'll panic under fire." To the men, the idea of women flying combat seemed laughable, a temporary stunt born of desperation. But history remembers those who act, not those who laugh. And soon, the laughter would stop. They lack the physical strength for aerobatic maneuvers. They'll freeze in crisis situations. This entire experiment will result in unnecessary deaths and wasted aircraft we cannot afford to lose. Volkov nodded agreement. The motherland is desperate for pilots, but this is desperation taken too far. Women should be nursing the wounded, working in factories, supporting the war effort in appropriate roles. Combat aviation requires qualities women simply don't possess. This initiative will fail, and we'll waste valuable training resources proving what we already know. Neither man could have predicted that within 18 months, those women pilots they dismissed would be conducting nightly bombing raids that terrorized German forces across the Eastern Front. And before we continue, if stories like these, where history proves everyone wrong, fascinate you, then make sure you're subscribed. We uncover true stories the world tried to forget, just like this one. Within 2 years, German soldiers would be offering rewards for shooting down the women aviators they called Nachthexen, night witches. Within 3 years, 23 of these women pilots would receive the Soviet Union's highest military honor, the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, for completing more combat missions than most male pilots would fly in their entire careers. And by war's end, the female aviators of the 588 Night Bomber Regiment, the Night Witches, would have flown over 30,000 combat sorties, dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs on German positions, and become the most decorated female combat unit in history. They would prove that courage, skill, and determination had no gender, and that male pilots who had sneered at women in cockpits would eventually beg to fly alongside them. The story of the Night Witches began not with military planning, but with a single determined woman who refused to accept that aviation was exclusively male domain. Marina Raskova was already the Soviet Union's most famous female aviator before the war began. In 1938, she had set the world record for longest straight-line distance flight by a female crew, flying over 6,000 kilometers in 26 hours. She had become a national celebrity, proof that Soviet women could achieve what women in capitalist countries supposedly could not. When Germany invaded on June 22, 1941, Raskova was inundated with letters from women across the Soviet Union volunteering for military service. They wanted to fly combat missions, to defend their homeland, to contribute directly to the fight against fascism. But Soviet military doctrine, like military doctrine everywhere in 1941, did not envision women in combat aviation roles. Women could serve as nurses, radio operators, mechanics, support roles. But pilots, navigators, combat crew? This was considered impossible. Raskova went directly to Joseph Stalin with a proposal. Allow her to recruit and train 3 all-female aviation regiments. One would fly fighters, one would fly dive bombers, one would fly night harassment bombers using obsolete Po-2 biplanes. These units would prove that women could perform combat aviation roles as effectively as men. Stalin, facing military catastrophe as German forces drove deep into Soviet territory, approved the experiment. If nothing else, it would free up male pilots for frontline fighter and bomber units. On October 8, 1941, Order Number 0099 established 3 women's aviation regiments. Marina Raskova was appointed to command and organize these unprecedented units. The recruitment was extraordinary. Over 2,000 women applied. They came from every background: university students, factory workers, teachers, engineers. They ranged in age from 17 to 26. All were volunteers. All were willing to die for the motherland, and all faced skepticism, mockery, and outright hostility from the male-dominated Soviet Air Force establishment that believed women had no place in combat aircraft. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, which would become the legendary Night Witches, was equipped with the Polikarpov Po-2, a slow, fabric-covered biplane originally designed for crop dusting and training. The aircraft had open cockpits, no radios, no guns except for the navigator's personal rifle, and a maximum speed of 94 miles per hour. It was constructed of plywood and canvas stretched over a wooden frame. A single bullet in the right location could set the entire aircraft on fire. Male pilots looked at the Po-2 and laughed. This was not a combat aircraft. This was a training toy, now being given to women to fly against the Wehrmacht. The entire concept seemed designed to prove that women couldn't handle real combat aviation, giving them obsolete, defenseless aircraft and sending them against the most powerful military machine in Europe. "They've given them flying coffins," Captain Volkov observed when he saw the Po-2 biplanes being prepared for the women's regiment. "Canvas and wood against German anti-aircraft guns and fighters. This isn't a combat unit, it's a mass suicide operation. When these women start dying by the dozens, the experiment will end, and we can return to serious military aviation." But the women of the 588th Regiment understood something their male critics did not. The Po-2's apparent weaknesses could be turned into tactical advantages. The aircraft was so slow that German fighters, which stalled at speeds higher than the Po-2's maximum velocity, couldn't effectively engage it without risk of falling out of the sky. The wooden and canvas construction didn't reflect radar, making the aircraft nearly invisible to German detection equipment. The quiet engine could be cut during bombing runs, allowing the aircraft to glide silently over German positions before releasing bombs. The distinctive sound of wind whistling through the wing-bracing wires was all that German soldiers would hear before explosives rained down. The women developed tactics that exploited these characteristics. They would fly at night in groups of 3. 2 aircraft would approach German positions with engines running, drawing searchlight and anti-aircraft fire. While German gunners focused on these decoys, the 3rd aircraft would cut its engine and glide silently over the target, release its bombs, then restart the engine and escape in darkness. The process would repeat with aircraft rotating roles, a methodical, dangerous routine they would execute multiple times every night. The first combat missions in June 1942 seemed to validate male skeptics' predictions. The Po-2 biplanes were slow, vulnerable, and carried minimal bomb loads, only 350 kilograms per aircraft. German anti-aircraft gunners initially treated the night raids as nuisances rather than serious threats. The aircraft seemed too primitive to be dangerous, but the women kept coming, night after night, multiple sorties per night. Senior Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova would fly 852 combat missions during the war, more than almost any Soviet pilot, male or female. Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, the regiment's commanding officer, would lead from the front, flying hundreds of missions herself while managing the unit's operations. The women pilots would routinely fly 5, 6, sometimes 8 sorties in a single night, landing, refueling, rearming, and returning to German lines within 30 minutes. German forces began to recognize that these nuisance raids were systematically disrupting their operations. The constant night attacks prevented rest, forced constant alert status, and damaged supplies, equipment, and infrastructure with remarkable consistency. More psychologically damaging, the attacks came from aircraft German soldiers couldn't effectively counter. Fighters couldn't catch the slow biplanes. Anti-aircraft fire couldn't predict their silent gliding approaches. The persistent, inescapable nature of the attacks created psychological stress that degraded combat effectiveness. German soldiers began calling the women flyers Nachthexen, night witches, claiming the distinctive sound of the Po-2's wing-bracing wires in the wind sounded like a witch's broomstick. The name, intended as an insult, became a badge of honor that the women embraced. They were witches who haunted German positions nightly, who appeared from darkness without warning, who could not be stopped or escaped. By late 1942, German military authorities recognized the Night Witches as a serious tactical problem. Rewards were offered for shooting down the women's aircraft. Any German soldier who destroyed a Night Witch aircraft would automatically receive the Iron Cross. This was the same award given for destroying a 4-engine bomber or multiple fighter aircraft. The Germans had effectively acknowledged that one obsolete Po-2 flown by women was as strategically valuable as far more powerful aircraft. Senior Sergeant Rufina Gasheva and Lieutenant Natalia Mecklin flew a particularly audacious mission in August 1942 that demonstrated the Night Witches' courage and skill. Assigned to bomb a German headquarters near Belorechensky, they encountered intense anti-aircraft fire that damaged their aircraft. Rather than abort, they continued to target, released their bombs directly on the headquarters building, then flew the damaged Po-2 back to Soviet lines, landing with the aircraft on fire. Both women survived and flew again the next night. They would each be awarded Hero of the Soviet Union for their combined 860 combat missions. Soviet male pilots, who had initially mocked the women's regiment, began to recognize the extraordinary courage required for what the Night Witches were doing, flying obsolete, defenseless aircraft into enemy fire night after night, multiple sorties per night, often in terrible weather conditions that grounded other units. This wasn't the behavior of people who froze in crisis or lacked courage. This was combat performance exceeding what most male units achieved. Lieutenant Alexander Vasilyev, a fighter pilot who flew escort missions with the Night Witches in 1943, later reflected, "We mocked them at first. Women flying wooden biplanes against the Wehrmacht. It seemed absurd. Then I flew with them one night. They made 8 sorties while I made 2. They flew through conditions I wouldn't attempt. They took fire that would have made me abort the mission. I watched one of their aircraft get hit by anti-aircraft fire, catch fire, and the pilot kept flying to the target, dropped her bombs, then crash-landed in Soviet territory. Both crew members survived. These women weren't pretending to be soldiers. They were better soldiers than most men I knew. The casualties were severe. The Night Witches lost 30 aircrew killed in action during the war, approximately 1/3 of the personnel who served in the regiment. The casualty rate would have been considered unacceptable for most military units, but the women kept flying, kept volunteering, kept returning to German lines night after night, despite knowing the risks. Junior Lieutenant Yevgenia Jigulenko described the psychological toll in post-war interviews. "We were terrified every single night. The Po-2 would burn if hit, canvas and wood, soaked in aviation fuel, with no fire suppression. We knew that if we were hit, we would probably burn to death before we could crash. But we flew anyway because our country needed us, because our male comrades were fighting and dying, and because we had proven we could do this, and we wouldn't quit just because it was hard." By 1943, the Soviet Air Force Command had stopped dismissing women aviators as experimental curiosities. The Night Witches' combat record was undeniable. The regiment had conducted over 15,000 combat sorties by mid-1943. They had disrupted German operations consistently. They had demonstrated courage and skill that exceeded many male units. The experiment had become the standard. Women could and would serve in combat aviation roles throughout the remainder of the war. The Battle of Caucasus in late 1942 and early 1943 demonstrated the Night Witches' strategic value. German forces attempting to capture Caucasus oil fields faced nightly harassment from the 588th Regiment. The women flew up to 18 sorties per night during critical battles, bombing German troop concentrations, supply depots, and transportation routes. The cumulative effect: disrupted sleep, damaged supplies, psychological stress, degraded German combat effectiveness measurably. German unit commanders reported to higher headquarters that the Night Witch raids were causing morale problems and operational difficulties disproportionate to the small bomb loads involved. The psychological impact of being unable to defend against or escape from persistent night attacks was breaking down unit cohesion. Soldiers requested transfers away from sectors where Night Witch activity was heaviest. The 588th Regiment participated in every major Soviet campaign from 1942 through war's end: the Battle of Caucasus, the Battle of Kuban, the liberation of Crimea, the liberation of Belarus, Poland, and the final assault on Germany. By May 1945, the regiment had flown 23,672 combat sorties, dropped 23,000 tons of bombs, and received 23 Hero of the Soviet Union awards, the highest concentration of this decoration for any comparable unit, male or female. Major Yevgeny Prokofiev, the instructor who had dismissed women pilots as incompetent in June 1941, encountered several Night Witches veterans at a military ceremony in Moscow in May 1945. He approached them with visible embarrassment. "I owe you an apology. In 1941, I said women couldn't fly combat missions, that you would panic under fire, that the experiment would fail. I was wrong about everything. You flew more missions than I did. You faced worse conditions than I faced. You demonstrated courage I'm not certain I possess. I was a fool, and the motherland is fortunate you proved me wrong." Captain Nadezhda Popova, who by war's end had flown 852 combat sorties, more than nearly any Soviet aviator, responded, "We didn't fly to prove men wrong. We flew to defend our country. But yes, you were wrong, and thousands of other men were wrong. Women can do anything men can do if given the chance. We proved that over German lines, night after night, for 4 years." Post-war analysis validated what frontline experience had demonstrated. The Night Witches' 23,672 combat sorties represented approximately 3% of all Soviet night bombing missions during the war, conducted by a single regiment flying obsolete aircraft. Their success rate, percentage of missions that achieved target effects, exceeded the average for Soviet aviation. Their casualty rate, while significant, was lower than many comparable male units flying more advanced aircraft. They had achieved operational effects far exceeding what their equipment and resources should have theoretically allowed. The women of the 588th Regiment proved several things that military establishments worldwide had previously denied. First, that women could perform in combat roles as effectively as men when given proper training and opportunity. Second, that courage, determination, and skill were more important than physical strength in modern aerial warfare. Third, that tactical innovation and psychological warfare could overcome equipment deficiencies. And finally, that gender-based assumptions about military capability were cultural prejudices rather than objective assessments of ability. After the war, most Night Witches veterans returned to civilian life. They became teachers, engineers, doctors, mothers. They had proven they could be combat aviators, but chose to use their education and intelligence for reconstruction rather than continuing military careers. The Soviet government, while celebrating their wartime achievements, did not integrate women into peacetime combat aviation roles. The wartime experiment was considered temporary rather than a permanent change to military doctrine. This contradiction, celebrating women's wartime combat service while excluding them from peacetime military roles, reflected ongoing institutional resistance to fully accepting that women could be warriors. The Night Witches had demonstrated capability that exceeded most male pilots, yet the conclusion drawn was not women should serve in combat roles, but rather women served heroically during desperate circumstances, but should return to traditional roles in peacetime. The legacy of the Night Witches extends far beyond their impressive combat statistics. They proved that assumptions about gender and capability were wrong, that institutional prejudice was limiting military effectiveness, and that courage and skill had no biological requirements. Every modern military force that now integrates women into combat roles owes something to the 588th Night Bomber Regiment and the women who flew canvas and wood biplanes into German fire to prove that warriors are defined by their actions, not their gender. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of VE Day, surviving Night Witches veterans gathered in Moscow for a reunion. Fewer than 30 remained alive. They were in their 70s, grandmothers, elderly women who looked nothing like the fierce young aviators of wartime photographs. But when they spoke of their service, the courage and determination that had carried them through 30,000 combat sorties was still evident. Nadezhda Popova, then 73 years old, reflected on what they had accomplished. We were 17, 18, 19 years old. Girls, really. Our country was being destroyed, our people were dying, and we wanted to fight back. They gave us wooden airplanes and told us it was all they had. We took those wooden airplanes and used them as weapons, because that's what warriors do. They use whatever they have and find a way to win. We weren't trying to make history or prove political points about women's rights. We were just trying to survive the night, fly another mission, drop our bombs on German positions, and make it back alive. That we flew 30,000 missions doing this still amazes me. Soviet pilots had sneered at women in combat, assuming that gender-determined capability, that women lacked the qualities necessary for aerial warfare, that the experiment would fail and prove what male aviators already knew. Instead, the Night Witches proved that courage, skill, and determination transcend gender, that warriors are created by circumstances and choices rather than biology, and that sometimes the most underestimated people accomplish the most extraordinary things. The women who flew canvas and wood biplanes into Germany anti-aircraft fire night after night didn't just fight in World War II. They fought against centuries of assumptions about what women could and couldn't do. They won both battles, and their legacy endures in every woman who serves in military aviation today. Proof that the Night Witches' 30,000 combat sorties changed not just the Eastern Front, but the fundamental understanding of who could be a warrior. Their story reminds us that true strength isn't defined by muscle or rank. It's defined by the will to rise, to fight, and to keep flying, even when the world tells you not to.